Welcome back. This video is going to continue in our study of the Thomas Christians, and this video is really the point of what we've been aiming at, and that is to look at the theology of the Thomas Christians, this being, of course, in historical theology. And so let me turn our attention to that, the theology of the Thomas Christians. There are a few sources for the theology of the Thomas Christians since the Portuguese destroyed virtually all of their written sources, as we have seen, and we'll mention that again. The lack of any original source of Thomas community is due to the fact that these original documents or artifacts, all of the things that would have told us about who the Thomas Christians are and what they believe, were pretty much burned up by the Portuguese bishops and early missionaries. The Thomas Christians, the Christian community of the Malabar, in spite of its ancient origin, didn't produce any theological system. This might have been due again to their isolation in the far corner of South India, as you can see it illustrated there, their historical dependence on the East Syrians for their liturgy and prayers and ecclesiastical administration, as we've just seen, and to their easy accommodation to the Hindu culture around them. And so this is probably why the theology of the Thomas Christians was not terribly well developed. However, there seems to have been a lived theology. The spirit of the Thomas Christians and their Christianity was not a set of doctrines, systems, or abstract and speculative theological thinking, but a way of life, lived in concrete, actual context. They lived a profound theology rather than created a theological system of categories. Eastern methodology of doing theology by means of hymns, poetry, narrative, doxology, and prayers, in contrast to the philosophical and speculative theology of the West, is widely acknowledged and appreciated today. This is very true. So if you want to do historical theology or any theology in Asia, but typically what you have to look at are the indigenous hymns, prayers, practices, and just the lived experience of Christians, and discern a theology from that. And it's not that you couldn't put it down in terms of propositions or even a systematic theology per se, but that's not how it was, how it is actually developed. So that is the type of theology that we are looking at for the Thomas Christians as well. So their Christology. Christ became more of an example instead of the risen Lord himself. The school of thought went against the belief that Christ existed in a hypostatic union. You can see this because they were Nestorian. They didn't really have a sort of doctrine of hypostatic union because they were Nestorians. Remember, Nestorianism had been rejected in the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD, and so and the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, which is the council that established the two natures of Christ and what we call the hypostatic union, came after the Nestorians had sort of been split off already. So rather than two persons sharing one body, this in turn caused the view of Christ as a moral example. So that was their Christology. Their view of Christology then is mixed with a sort of a set of Hindu ethics. Not that it was conscious, but it was something that they did sort of, again, in terms of their practice. They saw the best of what they had heard in terms of Hindu ethical principles and attributed those to Christ, sometimes saw them in the teachings of Christ. To this day, you can see old Christian churches filled with Persian crosses. Not only that, but the architecture itself was heavily influenced by Hindu structures, showing further evidence that the Thomas Christians were affected by Eastern leaders. The theology of the Thomas Christians was significantly altered at the Synod of Diamper, which we have already mentioned in a previous lecture. The Diocesan Synod of the Thomas Christians, or the Syriac Rite Christians of Kerala, held in the village of Diamper to the south of Kochi, marked a watershed in the process of strengthening Roman Catholic and Portuguese control over the Thomas Christians. Prior to the Synod of the Emperor, the Thomas Christians had followed the theology and practice, as we said, of the Eastern Syrian churches. However, in the second half of the 16th century, there was an increase of the activities of the Latin missionaries and the Portuguese. And we've already seen this, and it was partially driven by economics. They wanted the Thomas Christians to work with them in terms of trade, particularly the spice trade. The result of their leaders made the agreement to introduce a number of Latin practices into the liturgy of the Thomas Christians. The Synod of the Emperor, attended by 153 local priests and 660 lay representatives, lasted from the 20th to the 27th of June, again in 1599, and passed more than 200 decrees in rapid succession and evidently without any serious debate. Basically, it was something that was just imposed upon them. The decrees covered doctrinal, liturgical, customary matters, were designed to bring the Church of the Thomas Christians in line with the post-Tridentine, that's post-Council of Trent. Remember, we saw that with the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent. So the Portuguese missionaries, Catholic missionaries, basically insisted that the Thomas Christians bring their theology into alignment with that Counter-Reformation theology of the Council of Trent. They also forced the church at this time to sever its links with the Eastern Syriac Church, and that included condemnations of the Nestorian heresy and prohibition of any recognition of the Patriarch of Babylon. The proper flight, that is, method of Christian theology, took place only after the colonial missionaries. This is according to this author. Missionaries from the West attempted to proclaim the gospel in Indian manner. Therefore, Indian Christian theology is an attempt to recognize an Indian approach. Thus, it made serious attempts to reflect the Christian faith in the context of the challenges from an Indian background. Whether they were successful in this or not is something that's debatable, but what I want us to see was that's, at least in terms of not theological conclusion, at least theological methodology, what they were attempting to do. Again, let me read this. They made a serious attempt to reflect the Christian faith in the context of the challenges from Indian background. These missionaries also understood the social realities, and so accordingly they started medical missions, orphanages, schools, and they stood against the social evils like sati, female infanticide, etc. So in terms of the theology of the Thomas Christians, from that point on, the challenges to a Christian theology in progress were colonialism, that we've talked about a little bit, religious pluralism, which is something that continues to be a challenge for the theology of not just India, Christians in India, but all over the Asian world. Social economic conditions, as we've already seen, that often is something that takes precedent. It's very difficult to do theology if you're facing again, pandemics or diseases or socioeconomic conditions, particularly, again, the imposition of external authority the way the colonials did. But the churches have made progress in terms of interfaith dialogue and in terms of contextualization. So again, Indian Christian theology is a Christian theological activity carried on in India and thus connected to the religio, cultural, and social cultural realities. The task of Indian Christian theology is to present theology relevant to Indian context. It aims to communicate the self-disclosure of God in the particular context and commitment to renew the context, thereby to the life of God should be manifested. Down through the centuries, this purpose has had diverse theological formations. So we're not talking about, again, we're not necessarily talking about theological conclusions, but what I want us to see here is there's a sort of recognition of a certain methodology that needs to take this in mind. So I'm going to stop the video lecture here. I encourage you to read the rest of this discussion in the notes that have been provided, and please use that the rest of these notes in part of your lecture summary. They are part of the lecture. And with that, we will stop for now and see you next time.